So the story of Virginia for the last, let's call it 75 years. The story of Virginia for the last 75 years is of the dramatic, really dramatic change in the composition of the Virginia population. And just as importantly, the even more dramatic change in the composition of who participates in political and economic and cultural Virginia. That's the story that this book tries to tell. And it does so using 6 elections, fairly arbitrarily chosen by me, as a way of telling the narrative. Starting in 1949, I'll explain why I start there, starting in 1949 and up through the end of the century. It stops, although we'll talk a little bit tonight about 21st century Virginia, but the book really goes up to and through the 90s, because most of the change that is identified in the couple of decades leading up to that has either happened or is so clear where it's heading that no further narrative is really necessary. It's a dramatic change in who lives here. It's a dramatic change in where they live in Virginia. It's a dramatic change in where they work and what they do in Virginia. Not surprising, given the span of years that it covers, but arguably more dramatic than occurred anywhere else, certainly in the South, and with the possible exception of some of the western states, California, Arizona, Nevada, probably more dramatic a change than happened anywhere else in the country. This is a snapshot of where we were in 1920. Population about 2.3 million, almost a third of which were African American in 1920. And 84% of the people who lived in Virginia in 1920 had been born in Virginia. And another considerable share had been born in North Carolina or Kentucky or up here in DC. Harry Byrd, about whom we will talk a lot, was born in West Virginia, not in Virginia, because that was the nearest hospital suitable for childbirth. So he was born there, as was then Senator Willis Robertson, his colleague in the United States Senate, both born in the same hospital in West Virginia. So he would not have been able to answer the question affirmatively that I asked at the outset of where were you born. He would have been able to answer the question of where did you grow up or where did you go to elementary school. The story of Virginia normally starts with this, with the 1902 Constitution. It's the beginning of a new century, but I'm going to start a little bit earlier, because to tell the story effectively, you got to go back and talk about the predecessor Constitution and what led to 1902. Predecessor Constitution was forced on Virginia at the end of Reconstruction as a condition for readmission to the Union. It was required that Virginia ratify certain national amendments to the U.S. Constitution, mostly having to do with reintroducing the African American population into society. Virginia was required to ratify them and to tailor a new constitution around those ethnic and cultural boundaries. And it did so, although it didn't like it very much. And what happened soon thereafter is a reassertion of control by, frankly, the very people that had been in charge of Virginia up through the 1830s and 40s and 50s. What one Virginia historian has called the grandees of government. most of whom trace their own personal and family heritage back to colonial times. So anyone trying to understand that has to understand what preceded it. The 1867-68 Constitution, Reconstruction, a society that the Virginia Cavaliers didn't desire, didn't want, and economically couldn't tolerate. And they very quickly reassumed control, thought about it for a little ways during the 1870s and 1880s. There was, as there was in much of the country, a populist movement called the Readjusters in the case of Virginia, led by, of course, a Civil War hero, Bill Mahone, and they fought over what to do about the pre-war Virginia debt, which was considerable, and whether it was going to be paid in full, whether it was going to be blown off, exactly how to treat the 40-some million dollars in pre-war debt that they had. They finally came to a compromise on that. And again, the Cavalier class, the grandees, whatever you want to call them, retook control at the end of that period. And by the time the national compromise was made that led to the end of Reconstruction, Virginia was already back in the ways that had driven it during the 300 years leading up to that. The state's politics, while turbulent in the 1870s and 1880s, was fairly reform-minded, and things like free public education for all white people was a part of the Constitution starting in 1867, and it stayed in. And educational reform became one of the hallmarks of the reform movement that the Cavalier class fought, but not very hard, and for the most part lost. What they did do, however, was begin to complain loudly about what they considered to be corruption in government, corruption in the ballot box, principally. And their answer to that problem was this. Their answer was to deny the franchise to significant classes of individuals, African Americans, but an awful lot of white people as well, to deny the franchise to them because it was their actions or the manipulation of them by others that was felt to be causing the corruption that they were complaining about. Carter Glass, a delegate from Lynchburg to that convention in 1902, made clear what the purpose of the convention was. It was to deny the franchise, the right to vote, to every Negro without too much impacting the ability of the white population, at least those that they wanted to vote, their ability to cast a ballot. And they were very successful. And they put in place a couple of devices in order to do that, in order to deny the franchise, the poll tax being a well-known one. I don't know about you, but the poll tax was in effect throughout most of my childhood, and you had to pay the poll tax 6 months before the election, and you had to have paid it 3 years in arrears. So you had to be pretty on top of what was going on in the electoral process to be able to recognize that you had to pay the poll tax. Now, if yours was a favorable vote and the local power structure knew you were a favorable vote, well, then the Commissioner of Revenue and the treasurer would simply make sure that your poll tax was included in whatever other tax bill was being sent to you and was paid as a part of that. So you were taken care of. If you were an unfriendly vote or somebody that they weren't certain about, they didn't bother, and it was up to you to get it done. Carter Glass went on to national fame as a United States Senator from Virginia for many years, as Secretary of the Treasury, and a man of some intellectual weight and of significance in Virginia's political history. So suppose you paid the poll tax, or the Commissioner of Revenue and the Treasurer made sure it was paid for you. You still had to actually register, which meant you had to know who the registrar was. Not an easy thing to find out in most Virginia counties. And you had to know when the registrar was receiving people to be registered, which usually only 2 or 3 days a week, 2 or 3 days a month, in the registrar's kitchen, usually around the kitchen table. And the registrar was empowered by state law to ask you about a provision in the Virginia Constitution and elicit from you your understanding of that provision, and had the discretion to decide whether your understanding was sufficient. And that was tested in courts a few times and stood up as a perfectly acceptable way to separate those who knew enough to vote from those who didn't. And the consequences of this are pretty clear. 1900, 264,000 Virginians voted. 4 years later, after the 1902 Constitution was put into place, it was about half that. The Republicans lost a lot of their heft in Virginia. They didn't have a lot to begin with, but they got had a disproportionate impact on Republican voters. And as you can see, a disproportionate impact on African-American voters, most of whom voted Republican in those days. And again, just numbers. You know, city of Richmond in 1900, 12,000 white votes cast, 6,000 black votes cast. 2 years later, it was earth-shaking in terms of who had the opportunity to participate in the electoral process. And you know, it's not surprising that them that was in control at the time fashioned it so that they could maintain their control. And following the 1902 Constitution, right on its heels, we went through the Jim Crow era and the passage of numerous statutes limiting not only that they couldn't vote, but African Americans had to have separate facilities in all sorts of things. And the era of the lost cause, the redefinition of what the Civil War had been all about, also rose during that same period. So here we are now, let's call it 1920, the numbers I showed you at the outset, 60 years after the opening salvo of the Civil War, and pre-war culture and pre-war society had been reinstituted. It was as if all that other stuff hadn't happened. And it was 1920, and it was back to the future, if you will, back to the regular order, back to control by, as I say, what Brent Tarter, a Virginia historian, has called the grandees of government running the place. Many of their descendants of the original grandees during the colonial period were still active and still doing things. And it was against this backdrop that Harry Byrd came to power. Harry Byrd was himself descended from one of the original grandees, William Byrd, certainly one of the largest plantation owners in colonial Virginia. And William Byrd II further enhanced the family's holdings in slaves as well as in land. It wasn't until William III, who apparently sort of temporized about where he stood at the time of the American Revolution, not a good thing to have done. And he squandered most of the family wealth, and a generation or two later, the Byrd family migrated west, as many did in that era, west of the first range of the Appalachians to settle in the upper reaches of the Shenandoah Valley around Winchester. As I say, Byrd traced his lineage to colonial Virginia through his ancestor William, but his family had become local publishers and orchardists in the upper reaches of the Shenandoah Valley. He became, when he was elected in 1925, the youngest governor in Virginia's history, and later, through his tenure in the United States Senate, our longest serving United States Senator, 32 years, succeeded by his son. Most importantly to our history, to what we're talking about, he became and was the patriarch of what was known as the organization, or if you didn't like it, the machine. And he was the one who gave the nod, the wink, when somebody was to be chosen in a Democratic primary for public office anywhere in Virginia. And his success built on a little bit an organization that a prior United States Senator had created, but Byrd, unlike his predecessor, actually liked politics, got deep into the organizing of politics, and really, by virtue of that, became the unquestioned leader of the organization in Virginia. And he assumed early in life control of the family newspaper business. And he did that in a way that tells us a lot about him. He was the champion of a pay-as-you-go philosophy of government, for sure, but personally as well. And the newspaper business, when he took it over from his father and his uncle, was in bad financial shape. So his solution to that was to put it on a pay-as-you-go basis, so that he would sell his newspapers. It was the Winchester Evening Star. So he'd sell his newspapers in the evening, collect the cash, take it to the paper mill the next morning to buy the paper he needed to run the newspaper that afternoon, and repeat the sequence the next day. It was literally a pay-as-you-go business. It was a cash business, and credit was not something that he was extended to him, and I'm not sure he would have accepted it had it been extended to him, because of his own personal belief that debt was anathema to his family, perhaps because of the ancestor having squandered the earlier fortune, or perhaps it was a more deeply felt philosophy. But he very quickly, he was appointed to the Winchester City Council, didn't like it very much, elected to the state Senate in 1915, and became state party chairman, important spot, in 1922. And his organizational skills were then put to good use, because it was around the party chairmanship that he built his following, first positioning himself to run for governor, which he did successfully in 1925, and then a few years after the end of his gubernatorial term to get appointed to the United States Senate. His gubernatorial term was what most people would consider to have been quite progressive for the time. He reorganized state government, and on one level that was important to do, and it was well done and well thought about. On another level, what he did was greatly enhance the power of the office of the governor. First of all, prior to his changes, there were other statewide officials who were elected. We elected the Secretary of State. We elected the treasurer. I don't think we called it the treasurer at the time, but there were other statewide elected officials who could be independent sources of power. That wasn't in his playbook. So he consolidated those through statutory and constitutional change, and he reduced the number of agencies or departments in state government to a few, every one of which was headed by a gubernatorial appointee. There was no sharing of authority, still isn't any sharing of authority by the executive. We have a one-term executive. We're the only state in the union that has a one-term executive, but it's a very powerful executive during the course of that one term. So his reorganization efforts really provided additional support for the organization that he began to build. External influences in Virginia, as we've said, were very few. Most people were born here, or they were born nearby, or maybe they were born somewhere else in the South, but they grew up in the same culture as everybody who'd been born here had grown up in. Byrd inherited, as I said, some semblance of a statewide organization, but enhanced it, polished it, changed it, reformed it, and involved himself in great detail in all of its particulars. It's worth just taking a couple of minutes and understanding how it worked. First important thing to know is that it was a very, very restricted electorate. We talked about it earlier. No African Americans voting, not many white people voting. So the electorate was very small and hence controllable. Politically based in the rural areas, which was most of Virginia, all along the North Carolina border, so-called South Side, and up and down the Shenandoah Valley, rich in small and medium-sized farms. Those two combined with, frankly, the government in Richmond, most of which he appointed, those three provided his power base. He relied on the constitutional officers, David, and that was the source. Those were the key people in the organizational structure. So the clerk of the court in Brunswick County and the sheriff and the treasurer and the commissioner of revenue really ran the organization as well as their own individual so-called constitutional officers. Constitutional because their powers and duties are enumerated in the state constitution, and the fact that they are locally elected spelled out in the state constitution. And from that, he built this organization. And if you look at it, you see he operated through a couple of key lieutenants, Ebby Combs, being a Southwest Virginia former clerk in Russell County, that he befriended early on in his quest to reorganize the state party. Ebby Combs served simultaneously as the head of the state compensation board, more about that in a second, and clerk of the state senate. Those two power levers gave Ebby Combs a lot of authority, put him in touch with a lot of people, and he was Byrd's eyes and ears, particularly after Byrd had gone off to Washington to be in the Senate. Ebby Combs was his firsthand source of information. What's the state compensation board, you say? Well, particularly in those days, it was critical because it determined the level of funding for the constitutional officers in individual counties and cities around the state. If the clerk of the court needed more funding in Brunswick County, it was to the state comp board that clerk issued his petition. And sure, there were other ways to kind of get it done, but you better not go around Ebby Combs, because there was a price to be paid if you did. And that was true of the sheriff, the commissioner of revenue, the Commonwealth attorney, the treasurer. So they were beholden through Ebby Combs to Byrd and to the organization for their very wherewithal. And should one of them decide to go astray, chances are their funding would go astray somewhere along the way too. When you combine that with the fact that filling a vacancy in one of the constitutional offices was the prerogative and responsibility of the circuit court judge. So if somebody had the temerity to die in office, well, the circuit judge would decide who would fill out the term for the sheriff or the commissioner of revenue, whoever it was. And one didn't die in office. The rule of thumb was you never allowed an election to happen that did not have an incumbent office holder in that constitutional office. So you either died or you resigned in the middle of your term so somebody could be appointed to fill your term so that there'd be an incumbent when you got to election day. And, you know, the clerk of the court, heaven forbid, David, had an 8-year term. You know, give them a couple of terms and that's all they really needed. And the circuit court judge, who was himself, they were all male then, who was himself an appointee jointly from the Senate and the House of Delegates, frequently a former member of one or the other body. And it was an incestuous, ingrown, very effective, very powerful organization. Circuit court judge had other responsibilities as well. He appointed the school board trustees, who in turn appointed the school board. He appointed the local board of assessors. Wondering how your land's assessed? Check with the board of assessors. And the circuit judge had those kinds of key appointments in every county and city. And, you know, you didn't make an appointment lightly. You checked in with Ebby Combs, or maybe you checked in with the senior member of the House of Delegates, who was your patron when you were as a circuit judge, came up for reselection at the end of your term. So the machine functioned very smoothly. And this was one of the consequences of its functioning that way. The percent of people of voting age who actually participated in the election was really tiny. Now, those were the days when the election was the Democratic primary. There weren't enough Republicans to bother with, and they were very, if anything, limited in their location. So the Democratic primary was where all the fights were. And as you can see, the number of people voting was kept under very tight control. So the organization's strength, its success came from, if I can do this here, came from here, south side, here in the valley, and in and around the city of Richmond and the suburbs. While that was happening, what was going on here, here, and here began to form an alternative. And driven by the fact that what they shared was a lack of cultural affinity to Richmond. Southwest Virginia had not gone along with, and it had voted against the Civil War. There were no slaves out there. They didn't care. And they should have, a lot of those counties probably more rightly belonged with West Virginia than Virginia, but they stayed. Down here, increasing numbers of military operations out of Hampton Roads, more internationalist minded, not quite as focused on Richmond, and always felt like it was not getting its share. And speaking of feeling like you're not getting your share, certainly Northern Virginia felt that way always. It wasn't getting its fair share of much of anything. But the organization accurately reflected the economics and desires of these areas. So into the 30s and 40s, the organization functioned very smoothly. I jumped ahead here. It wasn't until the rumblings of the civil rights movement in the early 1950s, certainly focused first on education issues, that began to change. And if there's a seminal time in Virginia's 20th century, it certainly is the era of massive resistance. Massive resistance, as you know, was the term given to the state's opposition to and efforts to fight integration of the schools. And for the 25 years that followed massive resistance, where you stood as a political figure at the time of massive resistance on the issue of the closing of the schools was determinative of which side you were on. And people made their political decisions based on whether somebody had been in favor of or not in favor of the closing of the schools. And again, this is all within the Democratic Party, because by the close of World War II, the Republicans held none of the state's 9 congressional seats. They had 4 members of the 140-member state legislature, 2 in the House and 2 in the Senate, mostly from the Roanoke and Mountain Valley area in Western Virginia, so that the electoral foundation of the machine really kept everybody else at bay. But changing demographics were shifting that. And a small but self-described group of national Democrats took issue with Byrd when he adopted what was called golden silence with respect to the presidential nominees of his own party and freeing his supporters to vote Republican, and they did. They voted for Eisenhower, they voted for Nixon. They felt liberated by Harry Byrd saying, it's okay, it's okay. Don't worry about it. As long as we keep control at the state level and local level, who cares what those crazy people do in Washington? And that was really the ethic that governed the Virginia that I grew up in the 1950s. Those self-described national Democrats, led by a man named Francis Pickens Miller, in 1949 challenged the organization, strongest challenge it had ever had up to that point. Didn't win, but established themselves in the three corners of the state, most alien to Richmond geographically, established themselves as a potential alternative. Francis Pickens Miller, that was the high water mark of that generation of anti-Byrd leaders. The three corners of the state began to put forward their own people. And one of the great ironies of Virginia's history was that massive resistance, which we've just discussed, kept the organization, the machine, alive for another decade. It probably would have fallen of its own weight, but for the rallying cry of massive resistance. And it wasn't until the 1960s that began to unwind. The closing of the schools, again, became the dividing line between those who were for massive resistance and for keeping the old order in place and those who were not. While the initial reactions of the government to the closing of the schools, to the Brown v. Board decision, were fairly benign, that didn't last very long because a group called the Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberty rose up to take the forefront of the pro-school closing or pro-private school, pro-school choice, whatever you wanted to call it, movement. And this was not the rabble of Alabama or Mississippi. This was not the Klan. These were typically the respected business people, often the local lawyers or judges or Commonwealth attorneys, businessmen, bankers, who took the leadership of the defenders, as they were known, and gave a certain dignity to that position, which buttressed Byrd and the organization and held them aloft for the better part of another decade. And it wasn't until the schools had been reopened and things resettled a little bit in the early 1960s that a new generation of leaders began to come forward, and they had all opposed the closing of the schools. Education was the issue that they put to the forefront, but their common denominator was that they were a full generation in number of years and certainly in culture and background, a full generation younger than the Byrd going to the state Senate in 1915, or Willis Robertson going to the state Senate in 1916, or Judge Howard W. Smith going to the House of Representatives even prior to that. That generation of the Byrd organization began to get challenged. And in 1966, Robertson got knocked off by a younger man, went on to become Senator Bill Spong. two of the stalwarts of the organization, Howard Smith, got knocked off from his House of Representatives seat by a younger man, George Rawlings, who in turn lost to a Republican. And on the Republican side, too, was going through a generational change, which would give rise to the leaders that became the first viable Republican alternative in the 20th century. And that story is the story that this tells. There was political chaos nationally. Think back to 1968 and 1972 and the turmoil, not just on the news in the evening like we have now, but in the streets, in the politics, in the state conventions. There was turmoil in national politics, and it was reflected in the state politics as well. This stretch of years gives you a sense of how topsy-turvy it was. Bill Battle, son of former Governor John Battle, beat the populist state senator from Norfolk, Henry Howell, in a primary in 1969, but then lost to the Republican Linwood Holton, who combined the Republican base with a significant share of the populist vote, labor, several of the African-American organizations, enough to give him a narrow victory over the favored Democrat. Howell, not to be put down for too long, saw an opportunity, ran for lieutenant governor as an independent, thinking the Democratic label had been tainted, probably was in 1971. And the incumbent lieutenant governor died tragically. Howell filled his slot, ran as an independent for governor in 1973, and lost to Mills Godwin, whose story I'll tell in a second. And then he lost again in 1977 and slowly faded from the scene. But the story of Henry Howell is the story of the Democratic Party's confusion for the better part of a decade and a half. And you get dizzy watching all the switching of parties and moving around that they all went through. Republicans were going through it as well. Mills Godwin, who'd led the effort for massive resistance in the state Senate at the behest of the Byrd organization in the 1950s, morphed into this figure who had an extraordinary coalition of supporters from labor and the African-American organizations to business groups that he virtually walked into the governorship in 1965. And then Linwood Holton, the young Republican from Roanoke that lost to Mills Godwin in 65, ran again in 69 and turned the tables on the Democrats by assembling his own multicolored, multicultural coalition of African-American union and business support to win the seat and become the first Republican governor in the 20th century. Then he lost control of the Republican Party. A man named Dick Obenshain, through the state party chairmanship, which he won, controlling the state party, wrested it away from the more moderate, more forward-thinking Lynn Holton Republicans, and convinced Mills Godwin, of all people, to come back running this time as a Republican, which he did in 1973, mostly so that he could finally put an end, he thought, to Henry Howell's political ambitions. Henry Howell, to the business community, was anathema. And Godwin's job in 1973 was to make sure Howe didn't become governor. And while Godwin's first term, 65, been extraordinarily successful and progressive, his second term wasn't. And, you know, he didn't know what he was supposed to do second time. So all of this is a quick spin through 75 years of political history. And so the issue is, and what the book tries to address is, okay, how did we get from there to where we are now? And the quick answer to that is that two things drove it. One was the growing participation of African Americans in the process, and then the extraordinary demographic changes that overtook Virginia, not just in their sheer numbers, but in the disparate way they distributed around the state. This, the darker the color, the higher the percentage of African Americans in the population in 1930. This was Virginia's Black Belt. Not surprisingly, when you think about it, the higher the percentage of African Americans in the community, the more virulent the anti-Black feeling was, and more so expressed in its politics. Hence, a lot of those were the same counties that provided the overwhelming votes for the organization, since the African Americans weren't allowed to vote. And it was the white vote that was able to be turned out. So that began to change when the civil rights movement gave impetus to the change. And a quick story about a fairly unknown incident that occurred. Bobby Kennedy, then Attorney General for his brother, Jack, in April of 1961, invited to a meeting in his office the leaders of the newly formed Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a couple of others from the Justice Department and elsewhere, to try to dissuade them from further freedom rides, from getting on the interstate buses somewhere in the north and trying to make it all the way through Georgia, Alabama, into Mississippi, when, as we know, the nightly news in those months was full of pictures and stories of people being dragged off of those buses and beat up and thrown in jail. And those news clips were very troubling to a Kennedy administration already beginning to think about the next election cycle, because the Southern governors were on the phone to Kennedy saying, "What are you doing about this? Why can't you fix this?" So Bobby Kennedy's suggestion to these young people was, don't do the dangerous freedom rides. Focus on registering voters, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to count. Well, they're young, they're exuberant, they did both. The freedom rides continued, but they began to think hard about voter registration. And in that same meeting was a Fauquier County resident who, along with his wife, who happened to be a Mellon, granddaughter of Andrew Mellon, created a little foundation, the DeConnick Foundation, which began funding registration efforts. And Kennedy scurried around and got a favorable ruling from the Internal Revenue Service that voter registration, if done as education, was a permissible expenditure for a nonprofit foundation to give a grant. That allowed it to be opened up. It was housed in a project, an established organization in Atlanta. It was called the Voter Education Project. And because of their internal jealousies and rivalries, all of the national civil rights organizations signed on because they didn't want to be left behind. And volunteers and poorly paid intern students spread out across the South to register voters, one by one, finding out who the registrar was and where the office was and what hours it was open. And as was said in that, you know, if they got 69 or 75 people in a week, that was a good week in that particular county to get that number of newly registered people. And the time of registration, noon to 3 p.m., and the couple of days a month that it was open were real barriers, as was the poll tax in those days. But the poll tax very soon got declared unconstitutional, and even the poll tax in state elections got knocked out as unconstitutional. So the progress was slow, but it was inexorable. And these kinds of modest sums are what funded it, at least in Virginia. These are records taken from the files of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP, found in the Library of Congress mostly. These small grants, which would pay a volunteer or pay a canvasser $50 a week to go out and knock on doors. But it paid off. It paid off in significant ways, even before the Voting Rights Act. Here are some numbers just showing the pre-Voting Rights Act changes in the number of African-American registrants in a variety of counties across the state, including our own. That translates into votes. These are the votes from the 1973 election between Henry Howell and Mills Godwin. So it was post-Voting Rights Act when the African-American vote was at its greatest strength. Because of housing patterns and living patterns, you could pretty well identify what precincts in a city were predominantly African-American. This is a listing that University of Virginia compiled for many years of precincts in selected cities across the state. Look at Richmond. 15 precincts identified in Richmond as predominantly African-American precincts. Total vote of something in excess of 10,000. In that particular election, 96% of the votes that were cast in favor of Henry Howell. These were not slim margin precincts. These were overwhelming number precincts. And there were those all across the Commonwealth and in some counties. In the counties, a little harder to tell because the living patterns are not quite as clear as they are in most of the cities. So while the African-American vote increase certainly steered the ship in a certain direction, the real change came in the larger pattern of demographic growth. And the numbers tell the story. 40 years, Northern Virginia grows better than 400%. Most of the Byrd organization strength areas, particularly in what's called the South or South Side, shrunk in that same period. The mountain areas shrunk. Southwest Virginia shrunk. So the population shifted and the power center shifted along with the shift in population. This too contributed to the change from minuscule percentages being born elsewhere. We now typically have better than 50% of a given audience in Virginia will have been born someplace else. And, you know, they bring with them the culture and mores and backgrounds of wherever they came from. They don't necessarily fall into the pattern of the neighborhood or area in which they move. So just a couple of election more numbers quickly. The disparity between the voting patterns in Fairfax County as it was growing and Pittsylvania County, which up until the 1940s was the largest county in Virginia in population. So think of Pittsylvania right on the North Carolina border. Think of that as the largest concentration of Virginians in any county. Now, some of the cities were bigger, but in terms of the rural population, which is what the organization depended upon, Pittsylvania was the epitome of the organization. We went from 3 million population with Fairfax having less than 100,000 in 1950 because, you know, Arlington and Alexandria had already seen a lot of their growth, not all of it, but had seen a lot of it, and it was spreading out, and it had begun to spread into Fairfax County. By 1980, when Chuck Robb ran, we were almost at 5.5 million, and Robb carried Fairfax County, not by a lot, but by some. And though he lost Pittsylvania County, he lost it by a small number, and Fairfax could outpoll it without any difficulty at all. By the time Tim Kaine ran in 2005, the numbers were clear. Tim Kaine put together a margin out of Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax County that was just shy of what his total winning margin was statewide. Those three jurisdictions gave him 105,000 vote cushion. He won by 113,000 votes. So Kaine was really the first Virginia statewide politician to adopt a corridor-only policy of running for office. He knew where the votes were, and that's where he spent his time and his resources. And for the Democrats, going forward, from Kaine forward, that's the pattern. Mark Warner, who wondered when he saw the book, why am I not in the book, he said. I said, well, Mark, you're after all a 21st century Virginia politician, and this is a story of the 20th century, and that mollified him some. But he was the last of the Virginia Democrats to make a genuine effort to try to win a significant share of the rural vote. And he didn't win as much as he'd hoped, but he did win a significant enough share that, combined with slightly smaller margins in the urban areas, in Northern Virginia in particular, than Kaine got 4 years later, was able to put together a pretty convincing win. So who are these people? Who are all these people that have moved into Northern Virginia increasingly and are still moving into Northern Virginia further and further out as Northern Virginia gets redefined to include Fredericksburg, for example? You know, they arrived, as we all know, because we live here, went to work for the New Deal, and went to work in and around the Pentagon. They came mostly from northern states or the Midwest. And they brought with them who they were and how they voted and what they believed in. And they immediately disliked Richmond. Richmond seemed like a stultified place that didn't share their kind of open attitude on racial issues, which most new Northern Virginians were at least neutral on those issues. And the idea of closing the schools was absolutely anathema to these new Northern Virginians because, you know, they had young children, a lot of them, and they had no faith in the state ever doing it. And so they relied on the local school boards, Barbara, and others that they knew they could count on to provide for the public education for their children. They worked for government, or if they didn't work for government, Aunt Millie did, or their next door neighbor did, or the guy across the street. And so that they had an understanding of government and what it did more so than those people in Richmond and downstate. Not only that, they resented politicians from down there who ran against government because that was running against them. And that was not to be tolerated. And they brought their own values and quickly those spread as their numbers grew across Northern Virginia. And we became the odd man out in the state and were for a number of years until pretty recently. What was happening as well was a turning upside down of the economic drivers of the Virginia economy. If you look at numbers 19 and 20, those were the economic drivers of the Byrd era. Not particularly not 1 and 2, and probably not 3 and 4. Well, 4 they would have, you know, the furniture manufacturing and the textile manufacturing in Southside, but you know, they shrunk in comparison to the larger numbers in the upper categories because the economy flipped, and what drove the Virginia economy flipped. That was both a driver of and a reflection of the change in state politics. This is the whole lesson in a picture. Each color represents 50% of the state's population. And, you know, those numbers are pretty clear. And that has driven state politics and continues to drive it. So let's compare, go back to 1920 and 2020, snapshots of where we were and where we are. Population's not quite 4 times what it was. Black percentage of that population has shrunk, although the growing part of the population now is other non-white or whether white, Hispanic, or Asian, or whatever it might be. That's the growing part of the population. Born in Virginia, as I said, we went from 84% 100 years ago to less than half now. Number of political parties, I put 1 because that practically mattered in 1920. We only had 1 that mattered. Now we do have 2 functioning, active political parties. And as a part of that, and an important part of it, the percentage of people who actually participate in the electoral process has skyrocketed. And well, it should. The higher that number for my values, the better. And to go from 12.5% in 1920 to over 70% now of the age eligible population actually participating is a pretty good story to tell. So what does this mean for going forward? Well, everybody has their own answer to that question. For the Democrats, Tim Kaine has set the pattern. For a Democrat to win statewide, you focus on the urban corridor from Northern Virginia through Fredericksburg and Richmond and down into Hampton Roads and ignore the rest of it. Yeah, you don't really ignore it, but you don't spend a lot of time and resources in the rural areas. For a Republican, you've got to have two things. And the two Republicans who have been elected statewide in Virginia in this century, John Warner is his own case, but Bob McDonnell and Glenn Youngkin had both of those things. They had a strong base in the rural areas of Virginia, and they had a credible case, a strong case to be made as being relatable and related to the urban corridor. For Glenn Youngkin, who grew up in Virginia Beach and whose business was Northern Virginia based, for Bob McDonnell, who grew up in Northern Virginia and whose political life had come out of Virginia Beach, both of them could make credible, strong arguments and speak effectively to the suburban constituencies of both Northern Virginia and suburban Hampton Roads. That combined with rural strength in extraordinary numbers in Glenn Youngkin's case was sufficient and will be sufficient for a statewide candidate running as a Republican to continue to win. So people say Virginia is a blue state. It probably is in a presidential year. We'll see. But not so in state elections. Because people are willing to listen to somebody they think is talking to things that they believe should be talked about in Fairfax County or Virginia Beach or Wythe County or Pennsylvania or wherever it happens to be. And both the Republicans and the Democrats statewide have a pretty good shot at that. So that's my story. And I encourage you to take a look at the book if it's something that interests you. The Historical Society has bought a batch of them, and the whatever they're charging goes to the Historical Society, which is a good thing. I'd be happy to sit over there and sign some. And I'll take questions if we still have time.
Let's have some questions from the audience. Go ahead.
I think you ought to run, John.
Many have said so.
And after he gives his question, you need to repeat it.
Yep. All right.
Just a quick question. You've alluded to the fact that Virginia governors cannot succeed themselves immediately, and only very few have gone on. Just I guess Phil Godwin to succeed himself with somebody else in the middle. Do you ever see that changing in Virginia?
No.
And do you see either party benefiting from trying to do it?
I do not.
Repeat the question.
And the question is, Virginia is the only remaining state, as I said, that has a one-term governor. And because the governor is such a strong executive when in office, the only way that will change is if significant changes are made in the power of the governor while in office. When you talk to senior legislators, even the group that's there now, not many seniors are left in the legislature now, but they will tell you that why should they do that? Governors come and go, legislators stay on. And until there's a willingness on the part of some chief executive to make a complex compromise to cede a lot of appointment power and governing power to the legislative branch. I don't see it changing.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Build off his question, did other southern states that have the one-term rule, Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, did they, to the governors there, cede some of their power to then get?
You know, it varies. Florida, for example, has a almost powerless governor because he sits as a part of a cabinet and the decisions are cabinet made. The powers of the executive in some of the deep southern states are also shared in some fashion with exactly what it is in Mississippi and Georgia and whatever. I don't know. They tend to have more statewide elected officials, which almost by definition diffuses the power.
Thank you, Mr. John. Thank you so much. So Virginia is, like, I think from the national perspective, has probably been seen as like one of, you know, if you ask people to name a southern state, Virginia would be named as, you know, Georgia, Virginia. They quickly, you know, identified southern state. And as you pointed out, we're kind of less southern politically in a lot of ways. Obviously, what Democrats used to be is different than what, you know, the parties have kind of shifted who they're representing.
Right.
And so can you just talk a little bit about how you see, or is Virginia leading the way nationally in terms of like where a region is going? Are we just unique? What do you see? How do you see all this playing out?
Well, I think there's a narrow, the question is Virginia a forerunner of some other states following more or less the same cultural and political pattern that Virginia has followed in the last 50 years? Maybe a few, but it's a narrow band. I think it might include North Carolina, probably a decade behind us in that sense. It might include Kentucky, probably 2 decades behind us. It might include Tennessee, but I don't think it includes anybody else. Deep South is a completely different culture. And it's not going to see, I don't think, at least in the foreseeable future, the kind of demographic upheaval that really drove what we've had. We've all experienced the African-American Revolution, the rise in the proportion and participation level in the African-American community. That's true throughout the South. But unless there's an accompanying demographic upheaval, I don't see it happening anywhere else. Again, North Carolina, I think, is the likeliest candidate. Maybe Georgia. Maybe. Dan?
You're probably doing a whole other lecture on this, but you referenced Henry Howell, and it makes you ask about populism in Virginia, which never really took root, except for maybe Henry Howell. Any thoughts about why that didn't occur? Because we have a large African-American population. Henry Howell might have embodied that populism in Virginia, but it said that Virginia really never developed that, you know, the populist wings of the parties like in Alabama or some of the other southern states. Your thoughts about populism in Virginia?
Why Henry didn't do better?
Yeah. Why didn't he capture lightning in a bottle?
So the question is, Henry Howell, a major character on the Virginia political stage throughout the 60s and 70s, never quite made it. And one, he was completely anathema to the establishment. I mean, there probably has been no figure in 20th century Virginia that was more disliked, distrusted, and opposed by the professional and business establishment in Virginia than one was Henry Howell. I mean, Henry Howell's slogan, as everybody may remember, was keep the big boys honest. So the big boys did not want Henry Howell in the governorship. Had Henry set his sights on something less, he could have had a congressional seat from Hampton Roads anytime he wanted it. Didn't want it. that way he wanted to be governor of Virginia. That's, he was a unique personality. And, you're right, he had very strong African-American support, he had very strong Union support, and interestingly, in the 2 times he ran as an independent, he got significant support from the Wallace vote. Because Henry was a populist. Keeping the big boys honest was something that appealed to the Wallace vote. And when you look at where George Wallace got his support in precincts and counties across Southside Virginia, Henry tracked very well in all of those areas. But you get him in a suburban, getting to know you coffee or tea in the morning. His appeal was not to the suburban business people, male or female. And, might be different today, although I doubt it. But he never could get over the hump.
One more from this audience, and then we'll see about the chat.
Okay.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked a lot about the changing demographics in Virginia, particularly in Northern Virginia and Norfolk area. One of the real big changes in demographics is the involvement of women in professional and governmental jobs, in law, in politics, in lots of areas. Has there been any analysis done of the effects of the increased, probably informed nature of the female voter, and whether they've had any significant impact in all of these shifts that are going on?
There've been a lot of studies done, because if you think about it, that's mostly a 21st century phenomenon. It began before that, but it really didn't accelerate until the 90s.
Started when Vietnam
Certainly started there, no doubt, no question about that. And you see it, if for no other way, you see it in the explosion of the number of women in elective office. That's certainly one reflection of it. There certainly is a second reflection in the level of interest and attention to what are considered to be women's issues, whether it's childcare or something else having to do with a recognition of the rising number of women in the workforce who's have some responsibilities along with their husbands for family care, and whether it's parental leave or childcare or whatever it might be, those issues have come to the fore in the last couple of decades. So yeah, there've been studies done. I've not done one, but I certainly am aware of studies that have been done about the significance of the rise in the number and percentage and the impact they have on professional women.
Marty, can we go to questions from the chat room?
And that we don't have any questions from the Zoom domain, but I'm sure that all the people there want to get the presenter to sign the books they bought. So maybe the people in Zoom world are giving them the opportunity to get that to happen.
All right, great. Okay.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it.